Capitol Hill Briefing Series. Hello, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute's 2021 Capitol Hill Briefing Series. I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of CHCI. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month graduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional Latinos unparalleled exposure to hands-on experience in public policy. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, specifically in the areas of health, technology, housing, child welfare, and education. CHCI is thrilled to be able to offer our graduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues they're passionate about and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. We would like to thank our Graduate Fellowship Program sponsors for supporting the program, including Facebook, the PepsiCo Foundation, Casey Family Programs, the Walton Family Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, DaVita, Wells Fargo, CVS Health, Fresenius Medical Care, and Bank of America. You can keep today's conversation going by using the hashtag CHCI Fellows on social media. Please visit chci.org to learn more about our Graduate Fellowship Program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows via LinkedIn to find out more about their policy topic and help them connect with job opportunities for when their program concludes in May. Enjoy the discussion.
Please help me in welcoming Congressman Jamal Bowman, representing New York's 16th District and a member of the House Education and Labor Committee.
My name is Jamal Bowman, representing New York's 16th Congressional District. I want to thank the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute for hosting this discussion on the important topic of centering our students and their well-being in education. Prior to being elected to represent New York's 16th District, I worked in education for 20 years. My time as teacher, counselor, and as founding principal of Cornerstone Academy for Social Action in the Bronx informed my thoughts on this issue. I was honored to be elected as vice chair of the House Committee on Education and Labor, and I will use that post to advocate for students and student-centered policy. Today, our public schools are not built to realize the brilliance and potential of every student. The underfunding, understaffing, and reliance on rote memorization within our public schools work to crush our students' natural curiosity and creativity. Public schools have also been infected by our country's obsession with punitive measures. Many students, particularly in underserved Black and Latino communities, go to schools that are over-policed. Criminalizing students from a young age has a deleterious effect on their mental well-being and psyche. We also need to understand that the pandemic has exacerbated already existing mental health challenges for our students. We need to invest in school counselors as well as reacclimate our kids to in-person learning and soothe the wounds of a year of remote, often uninterrupted learning. For these reasons, I'm proud to be a co-sponsor for the Counseling Not Criminalization Act to divert federal funding from school-based law enforcement to more counselors who understand the challenges our students are facing and know how to work with them to overcome these challenges. We need to completely reimagine our public schools as places of holistic learning, nurturing, and care. Removing law enforcement and bringing in counselors is a big step towards making that goal a reality. It is my pleasure now to introduce Jessica Pedroza to take it from here.
Thank you for that introduction, Congressman Bowman. I'm inspired by your leadership and your fierce advocacy for students. I look forward to the change you will champion in Congress. Thank you to CHCI for allowing me the opportunity to host this briefing today, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to attend today. My name is Jessica Pedroza, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the CHCI Walton Family Foundation Education Graduate Fellow and your moderator for this conversation. I'm a Mexican-American, daughter of immigrants, first-generation college student and graduate, and former teacher who cares deeply about educational equity, access, and opportunity for all students. I'm honored to moderate this discussion on a timely issue, reimagining student safety, recognizing the disproportionate impact of school-based law enforcement on students of color, undocumented students, LGBTQ students, and students with disabilities, and working towards a safe, healthy, and inclusive school climate for all students. The U.S. Department of Justice defines school resource officers, or SROs, as sworn law enforcement officers. SRO programs vary greatly by program and state, but in practice, SROs engage in activities such as mentorship and teaching in addition to their law enforcement duties. School resource officers have recently become a part of a national conversation regarding racial justice in policing, although youth leaders have long led the way in calling for and continue to call for police-free schools across the country. Why police-free schools? Because evidence shows that the presence of SROs in schools contributes to the school to prison pipeline and the school to deportation pipeline. The data are both disturbing and unfortunately underreported. Latinx students are arrested at a rate of 1.3 times that of white students. Black and Latino boys with disabilities are only 3% of the student population, but comprise 12% of all student arrests. Although only 17% of public school enrollment, Black girls represent 43% of girls arrested at school. Students with disabilities are more likely to be restrained, secluded, referred to law enforcement, and arrested. And let's keep in mind the intersectional identities of students, as 1 in 4 Latinos in the US self-identify as Afro-Latino, and 1.8 million Latino students are identified as students with disabilities. SRO involvement has resulted in students, and disproportionately students of color and students with disabilities, being listed on gang databases, having their information shared to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, being slammed to the ground, being tasered, handcuffed, and even killed. At the same time, there is a lack of school-based mental health providers who can provide students with social, emotional, and mental health support. 48 states do not have the recommended student-to-counselor ratio of 250:1. Research shows that social, emotional, and mental health support positively impacts school climate and students' academic achievement, classroom behavior, on-task learning, and well-being. Our school system has prioritized exclusionary discipline practices over inclusive restorative practices. Our school system has prioritized law enforcement over mental health support. And as a result, millions of students go to school with a school resource officer, but no counselor or social worker. A year into a global pandemic, a year of hurt, loss, disruption, and despair for many, we know that students, whether they engage in remote, hybrid, or in-person learning, need school-based mental health providers now more than ever. Students need to be listened to, supported, and included, not arrested, criminalized, or subject to excessive force. Today, I am pleased to be joined by experts who can speak to the impact of school resource officers, the available data on school discipline, the need for school-based mental health providers, and alternatives to school-based law enforcement toward restorative and inclusive practices. A huge thank you and a warm welcome to my panelists. My first panelist is Daniel Lowson. Dan is the director of the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at UCLA's Civil Rights Project, where his work has focused on racial disproportionality in special education, graduation rates, and school discipline since 1999. The Center for Civil Rights Remedies award-winning report, Are We Closing the School Discipline Gap?, describes school districts with the most serious and persistent disparities along the lines of race, gender, and disability status. Some of its most recent reports describe the disparate harm from excessive punishment punishments that result in lost instructional time, chronic absenteeism, higher dropouts, referrals to police and the juvenile justice system, and huge economic costs. Lawson often consults state and district level administrators and policymakers to assist in their efforts to address inequity in education. His research not only raises serious civil and human rights concerns, it emphasizes the steps we can take to end the opportunity to learn gap. Dan?
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to join CHCI, Congressman Bowman, and you, Jessica. You're a great spokesperson for these issues, so I'm really honored to be presenting with you as well. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that is based on our most recent report, which is called Disabling Inequity, the Urgent Need for Race-Conscious Resource Remedies. And I will speak specifically, since we have very limited time, to the section of the report that alerts folks to the huge disparities along the lines of school policing and referrals to law enforcement. But first, it's important to note that there's something called the Civil Rights Data Collection that collects data from every school and district in the nation. Unfortunately, our report looks at all the secondary level because that's where we see most of the problems with school policing, although there's certainly problems when you see images of young kids being handcuffed. I'm not meaning to in any way distract from those real concerns. However, when we're looking at large data sets, most of the kids who are being referred to law enforcement, arrested for school conduct, are in middle schools and high schools, and that's where we see the largest disparities in terms of the volume of kids who are being pushed out of school and into the prison pipeline. So one of the really important things, though, to stress is that we found when we looked at all schools that had at least 1,000 secondary students, that 61% of all districts, not just schools, districts, reported 0 school-related arrests. And this included New York City and Pittsburgh and many other large cities where we have evidence, clear evidence, that that is not the case. They did arrest kids for school-based conduct. And this is really outrageous that, this has been a requirement of civil rights data collection, I believe, since 2009. Yet here we are still fighting to get accurate data. Our solution was to throw out all the districts that reported either 0 arrests or 0 referrals to law enforcement to really drill down on the districts that did report the data. But I don't want to leave out the fact that we need to do much more to hold districts accountable for reporting this information. Not only we have a right to know, imagine if this was test scores and districts decided not to report the scores of kids who weren't, performing well on tests. That would be an outrageous, or lying about their data, because this is what it does amount to. That would be a national scandal. Yet when we're arresting students and not reporting it, somehow it barely gets an eye blink. So let's go to the next slide. Here are some of our findings in California. Despite this limited data, we did find that there's almost 70,000 secondary students with disabilities. So this report really focused on kids with disabilities that attended school in one of the 44 districts where their risk for being referred to law enforcement was 2% or higher. It went as high as 12% in Apple Valley Unified School District, but there were districts where, including Los Angeles, where the rates of kids with disabilities and Black students with disabilities in particular being referred to law enforcement were higher than their out-of-school suspension rates. So this is outrageous and a very, very serious problem, and direct evidence of a school-to-prison pipeline that unfortunately people are not really paying enough attention to. Let's go to the next slide. So here is when we drilled down and looked at the referral rates. And again, these are all students who are eligible under the IDA. That means that many of these students may have disability-caused behaviors and a need for functional behavioral interventions and manifestation determinations to make sure they're not being excluded, or in this case, referred to the police because of behavior they can't control. Yet when we look at across the nation, in Lockport, Illinois, for example, for Latinx students with disabilities, 25% were referred to law enforcement. And in Council Bluffs, Iowa, 16% of Latinx students with disabilities, again, referred to law enforcement. Austin, Texas, 15%. So these are really high rates. You can see in the chart the comparable rates for kids without disabilities. So for example, Latinx students without disabilities are also being referred at high rates, but not nearly as high as the students that actually have disabilities. And then you can see the comparable rates for whites who are being referred. You can look at Lockport, Illinois, where no whites are referred to law enforcement. That suggests a dual system, which would be blatantly racist, and is something that we should be investigating. And groups like the enforcement agents, like the Office for Civil Rights, as well as state attorney general, should be investigating these districts for what looks, at least in this original slice of the data, to be discriminatory use of referrals to police. Let's go to the next slide. So the other concern is that students with disabilities have a right to have behavioral assessments, to have intervention plans as part of their individual education plans or their 504 plans. And they should have a manifestation determination if they're being suspended long-term. But when they're off the book suspensions, where kids are told to just go home and come back in a few days, or when the police are used and they're referred to the police and maybe they're arrested or detained and they miss school, but it's not counted as a suspension, then the whole accountability system and the procedural requirements that are there to protect kids with disabilities from unwarranted removal, that's compromised. And those protections are diluted based on these off the books. We hear about this from advocacy groups on the ground, including Cadre in Los Angeles, and many folks on the ground will say, yeah, we've reduced suspension rates, but now we're seeing, at least in some schools, principals using other ways to push kids out. So that's really important. And one of the ways that we capture that is through looking at chronic absenteeism, because oftentimes their attendance is recorded. So let's go to the final slide. So this shows in California, and this is disaggregated by homeless and low-income students and students with disabilities and students without disabilities. So the first set of columns you can see are for African American, then American Indian and Latinx students, and then white students. But you can see for all groups, and this is data from 2018-19. So we know that because of COVID-19, homelessness is on the rise. Not represented here, but also an issue is for kids who are in the foster youth. They are often the ones that have the highest rates of chronic absenteeism, and this may be capturing some of those off the book suspensions, inappropriate use of policing. And these rates are just incredible, because we know that if you're chronically absent, you're almost certainly on the path to dropping out of school and much more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system. So if we could go to the next slide, this may be the end. Yes, that's the end. So I think I'm probably about at 5 minutes. So thank you very much. There's a lot more to the report. We cover as well a whole section of kids who schools are failing to identify, and hopefully if we have time, I'll speak to those as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I definitely look forward to reading that report. I know that the CRDC releases data every 2 years, and so there is that gap in information, that lag. And we need accurate, reliable, and disaggregated state and federal education data on suspensions, arrests, and school resource officers. And ideally, it should be collected and released annually. I look forward to hearing your remarks for the rest of our discussion. My second panelist is Amir Whitaker. He's a staff attorney with the ACLU of Southern California. Prior to joining the ACLU, Amir represented students and incarcerated youth throughout Florida and Alabama. He has worked as a researcher with the UCLA Civil Rights Project and has written for Time Magazine, Washington Post, and other publications. Amir has taught across multiple educational settings for more than a decade and has held teaching credentials in Florida, California, and New Jersey. He received his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Southern California, Juris Doctorate from the University of Miami, and his bachelor's from Rutgers University. He contributed to ACLU's comprehensive and revealing report titled Cops and No Counselors, How the Lack of School Mental Health Staff is Harming Students. Amir Whitaker.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for having me, and thanks CHCI for hosting this important conversation. Thank you, Daniel, for that incredible information that you just shared. We're looking forward to that report. So yeah, I'll continue on, and I have some slides as well. And some of the information, Jessica, you shared in your intro, so I'll just be going through it really quick. And Dan also highlighted as well. But that picture right there, you can see me in the middle, kind of like a where's Waldo hidden back there. But that's one of the protests here in Los Angeles to defund school police, one of the many protests where people took to the streets last summer. Next slide, please. But the question I want to frame us with, when students return to school, how should they be greeted and treated, right? Should a police car be the first thing they see after returning to their campus in over a year? And unfortunately, that's the situation for a lot of students. And what does that say to what we expect from them and how we expect to serve them? Next slide, please. And here is just, on the left, we have some of our students, because I want to bring students' voice in as well. Our Youth Liberty Squad here in LA, we have students from over 30 high schools. And we did a banner project where we gave them just art supplies and told them to create banners representative of their voice. And naturally, Counselors Not Cops was something that came up. And to the right of that is a quote from our now Vice President, previously our Senator here in California, of our Counselors Not Cops report, which I should also share that I started this project when I was actually working for Dan Lawson, the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at the UCLA. That's when we started working with this data that found, 1.7 million students have a police in their school, but no counselor. 3 million have a police in their school with no nurse. And again, we're in this international pandemic. 6 million with police and no psychologist, and 10 million with no social worker. Next slide, please. And in California, we see there's about 1.8 million students in schools that have police, but no nurse, counselor, social worker, or psychologist. And that's about 30% of our students here, because we have about 6 million students. And, for a situation, for 1 out of 3 students nearly to be greeted that way is really a travesty. And as the graphic on the bottom right shows, here in California, we have one of the highest ratios of students to counselors, one counselor for every 682 students. And as Jessica mentioned, only 2 states are in blue or meet that counselor ratio of 250 to 1. Next slide, please. There's just one of my favorite pictures outside of the school board, where there were hundreds of people. That was back in June, but we had several actions there led by Students Deserve and Black Lives Matter that actually successfully resulted in the defunding of the police. But I want to share some of the data and some of the details from that campaign. Next slide, please. There's what you couldn't see behind the picture, but it says defund LASPD, or LA School Police Department, which is one of the largest school police departments and really one of the largest law enforcement departments in the state of California, with hundreds of officers. Next slide, please. And this shows a really disturbing trend that we uncovered. So back in 2008, before the recession, the green indicates the funding for art, which was at 78 million, and the blue indicates the funding for school police, which at the time was 51 million. If we go almost 10 years later to 2017, we see that trend actually reverse, unfortunately, with school police being almost 70 million, and we know they were receiving over 70 million, while the arts were receiving 31 million. So an inverse relationship through the governing of the school board members. So a 60% decrease in arts funding, while school police increased 24%. Next slide, please. So Students Deserve led a great initiative where they surveyed over 5,000 students over a week and found some really interesting trends. And some of these will be unpacking further in our report that's going to be released next month. But they found Black students were 3 times as likely to the white students to report being followed by police, 4 times as likely to report being racially profiled by police. And the survey asked students where would they want the funds to be reinvested, and most students had solutions, whether it was grief counselors, full-time psychiatric social workers, and other things. So it's not like they didn't have ideas or thoughts on where the funds should go. Next slide, please. And this is actually a word cloud visual representation of the data. So the most common word spoken by students was teachers, but students also said nurses. I mean, just 2 years ago, thousands of people were protesting here in LA because 80% of schools don't have a full-time nurse, right? Yet there's 500 school police here almost. But students said arts, music, field trip, college, just an array of things that actually support their academic success, evidence-based supports. Next slide, please. And this is just a preview of something that's going to come in our police report here in California. But here, Black students are 6% of California's enrollment, but 15% of student arrests and 26% of students stopped by police. California just released that data, and we'll do some analysis of that. And 3 times as likely to be arrested by police than their white peers. Students with disabilities are just 11% of California, but 26% of students arrests. Latino boys are 28% of California, but 44% of student arrests. And Black and Latino boys with disabilities are about 5% of California, but 13% of referrals to law enforcement and 15%, or 1 out of every 7 student arrests. Next slide, please. This was from another UCLA study that just shows the trends here in LA, that despite the most issues or most 911 calls being related to counseling, you can see there suicidal behavior and self-injury, were the most common reasons why police were called. The district still didn't invest in mental health support. And as the next slide shows, as district enrollment actually decreased, over that same period from 2005, 2007, district enrollment decreased, but school police increased for whatever reason. There was a decrease, 18% decrease in student enrollment, but 20% increase in school policing, $20 million investment in school police, which is almost a half, 48% investment. Next slide, please. And the Students Deserve survey and Black Lives Matter survey asked students specifically to share their experiences with police. And so many of the females shared that they were either sexually harassed by police or after reporting sexual harassment and rape threats, the police did nothing or actually blamed them. And we know there was actually a case in Sacramento where the police failed to respond adequately to threats of sexual harassment. So that's another thing. And Black girls in particular said they felt sexualized by police. Next slide. And here I just wanted to end with the good news is that the students' work and the community work did lead to a $25 million cut in reduction in the school police budget here in LA, and that there's been success in Oakland where they've eliminated the school police department and other districts. So the tide is changing, and students and even teachers, the teachers unions are coming out in support of removing school police, and that's been really critical in moving the needle. But there is progress and things are being made at the local and state level. And that concludes my presentation for now, and I look forward to the continued discussion later.
Thank you, Amir. I'm really glad that you brought up student advocacy piece. This is not a new conversation. This is a presentation about something that's already been happening. So for the audience, you can follow other students and organizations, hashtag arts not cops, hashtag police free schools, hashtag counseling not criminalization. And also you reminded me of a great report by the Advancement Project that also details some of the disproportionate impact of SROs.
Yes.
All right, so again, thank you. And let me introduce my third panelist. This is a student, so I'm really glad to be bringing him into the discussion. His name is Ethan Collier-Moreno. He's a high school senior and student activist attending Hilltop High School in San Diego, California. Attending school in the South Bay, San Diego, he has seen the true struggles that LGBTQ students face within his school district. Racism, homophobia, transphobia, and various issues plague the community he grew up in. Ethan served as the first openly gay student board member for the Sweetwater Union High School District Board of Trustees and the Region 12 president to the California Association of Student Councils. He currently serves as the policy director of Generation Ratify California, the national vice president of Coalesce 4, and a member of GLSEN National Student Council. Very impressive for a high school student. So thank you for coming, Ethan.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pedroza, for having me involved in this conversation. And thank you, Representative Bowman and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be contributing to this conversation regarding police within our schools, as police within our schools is not only just a systemic discriminatory issue amongst races, but is also very much an issue for our LGBTQ students. LGBTQ students are also one of the most marginalized groups within our school communities, and it's absolutely essential that we need to reform our justice systems within schooling. I would like to start out by saying that as a student, there was never a day that I walked into my school campus without a police car being in front of the school. And every day I would see at least one student be escorted out of our school by police. This could be for a variety of reasons, but it goes to show that we need systemic reform in the way we discipline our students, and rather change the disciplinary measures to be more transformative and restorative to ensure that students get the support that they need to be able to flourish within their school environments. While I do not have a formal presentation to present, and I would like to keep my remarks very, very brief for this time, I would just like to say that there is a need for systemic reform within our school disciplinary systems, and the time is now. As Mr. Whittaker mentioned earlier, there have been significant evidence to show that the removal of police within schools has tremendous effects on student emotional well-being and allows for students to flourish within their communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan, and definitely honored to have your student voice here today with us as well. Finally, my fourth panelist is Gerald Robinson. He is currently a restorative practices project facilitator and has been a licensed social worker with the Clark County School District since 2010. He began his career as a foster care social worker in Nevada and was later promoted to a program specialist for the foster care program at Clark County Department of Family Services. Mr. Robinson has also been a child welfare training specialist for the School of Social Work at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He continues as part-time instructor for UNLV as a field practicum liaison for the School of Social Work since 2005. And having recently retired from a 20-year football coaching career, he is better known as Coach Rob. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Ms. Pedroza. My fellow panelists, I really appreciate this opportunity to be with you guys today. This is a very exciting day, so thank you for having me. Again, my name is Gerald Robinson, and I am a project facilitator for the Support Services Division with the Clark County School District. I'm here in Las Vegas, Nevada. In Clark County, we offer the following professional development resources to enhance our restorative justice practice implementation in our schools. Next slide, please. Now, we started out by creating a restorative justice practice awareness video presentation that is offered to all of our staff members. Number two, what we did was after the video, we complete a school assessment to assist our schools in identifying their restorative practice needs. And number three, we share classroom circle implementation strategies, such as harm circles, mourning circles, check-in circles, and sequential circles. And number four, we share and offer a sample restorative justice program that has been operating in one of our local schools in our district where I happened to be one of the practitioners for about 6 years before I came over to support services. Now, this program teaches schools how to create a restorative justice tribunal process for minor behavior infractions that occur on campus. We also share and teach the schools how to create a specific restorative justice circle process for major behavior infractions. And finally, we teach schools how to develop what we call our restorative conference programs involving students, parents, teachers, administration, and other staff members. Next slide. Now, as I previously mentioned earlier, our awareness video presentation, it's a very large piece of our training because it reviews the legislative updates for Assembly Bill 168. Now, this requires that a change take place with statute regarding school discipline to reflect practices related to restorative practices. The video also talks about the history of restorative justice, as well as it elaborates on effective implementation strategies and the benefits of restorative justice practices. The video, in addition, talks about what is restorative practices, because a lot of our teachers and our staff members, they just don't know. It also explains, as was mentioned earlier by a few of our panelists, that traditional discipline contributes to our students entering the school to prison pipeline. Our African-American students, our Latinx students, our students with disabilities are at a higher risk. Now, throughout the video, we discuss how to apply restorative principles that can be utilized school-wide. We also outline restorative practice continuum, which ranges from formal to informal strategies. And lastly, we explain to our schools how to request our services from our department by completing our department's referral form. Next slide. Now, once we have the opportunity to present to our school staff, this enhances their belief in restorative justice practices. After the video, we encourage our administrators, our principals, to assist us in promoting the restorative practices concept by creating a school assessment team. Now, this team can be made up of an administrator, a teacher, a school counselor, a special education representative, maybe a campus monitor, and one of our mental health providers, one of our mental health professionals. We have a position that's called the safe school professional that we have at our district. We have a social worker that could be on this team, such as myself, and a psychologist, a school psychologist. We work with this team to identify social and emotional strategies that they're currently using on their campus and how we can create more restorative strategies. We also review and discuss the school's restorative discipline plan and how it can be amended to meet our students' needs. We introduce and provide restorative resources from our department's shared Google Drive. We have a ton of resources that are listed for our schools on our drive. Our project facilitators, my colleagues and I, we continue to coordinate with our district administrators to ensure that training is offered throughout the school year. All of the information that I'm sharing with you today is very vital to the development of what we call our restorative plan of action for our students. This is a document that must be completed prior to recommending suspension and expulsion. Next slide. Next slide. And I'm going to finish up by saying, once again, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being involved in this discussion today and look forward to our further conversation.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you all for your remarks. I am excited about the diversity of experience and expertise on our panel and welcome your thoughts on how we can reimagine student safety from school-based law enforcement to a safe, inclusive school climate. I have prepared a couple of questions for our panelists. Afterward, I will open it up to a Q&A session for the audience. My first question is, I have a lot of questions, but I will ask What is the impact of school resource officers and exclusionary discipline practices? And can you speak to the disproportionate impact on certain subgroups of students? I've already received a ton of data, so if there's just any quick things to add on certain subgroups of students, Latinx students, undocumented students, which we haven't really talked about, students with mixed status families, LGBTQ students, Black students, Native American students, and students with disabilities.
So I should mention Paul Martinez, who is a co-author of the report I just mentioned. In our last report in California, did a study of school policing in the high schools and did do a correlational analysis as part of his dissertation, and it also appeared in that California report, that showed that for Black students, having police on campus correlated with higher rates of lost instruction for Black students, but also the inverse. So where there were more than average numbers of student support personnel, which includes school nurses, psychologists, counselors, social workers. When those numbers were higher than average, the rates of lost instruction for Black students were lower than average at high school. So that was specifically looking at all the high schools in California. And this really tells us exactly what you folks know and have been telling us, but it tells us empirically so that if anyone is somehow questioning this, it's quite clear that adding police is a problem and adding support staff is part of the solution.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, and I'll add something really quick to that. Just the presence of police also increases the likelihood or increases the arrest rate and referral rate. That's an analysis we did in our upcoming report. And just an example of that, if a police is on campus, I had a student who threw a stapler and was charged with assault and battery, right? Whereas if that police officer wasn't there, it wouldn't have been viewed through the lens of a crime. It would have been viewed as a temper tantrum or the student acting out, and they would have been disciplined or hopefully some intervention. But that, just the presence of police creates a climate where more students will be referred to law enforcement or arrested.
Right, the presence of police kind of escalates things, right? Typical student behavior can be addressed by a teacher, can be addressed by other support staff in the schools. I used to be a teacher as well, and I definitely was very concerned about the mental health of my students. And would check in on them and sometimes had to refer them to a social worker because of some of the things that they were dealing with that I had no idea if I hadn't had those mental health check-ins. And obviously I wasn't trained to deal with those issues. So we definitely need more support staff and less law enforcement there to respond to typical student behavior.
Yes, but if I could share one more story related to that, Jessica, because we had a client who was grieving and was acting out because of the grief, and the school had no social worker. So instead of referring them to the social worker, he was referred to probation and placed in the criminal justice system. So, social workers are great when we have them, unfortunately, but most schools in California just don't even have access to a social worker or someone, doing the great work that Mr. Robinson does, facilitating restorative justice. Many students have never even heard of the term.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add, thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I really appreciate that. And, being a social worker for the years, wow, I'm going on a few decades here. It's really nice to see that social workers are valued nowadays, because I know when I first started in the profession many years ago, it was like, oh, a social worker, okay, well, what do you guys do? And it's really exciting. I talk to my colleagues all the time, and we finally feel that, we're being needed. And I do know that our district has recognized that need. And when I first started many years ago, it was probably about 20 of us for the entire district. And so now our district has increased those positions. And I believe the safe school professionals is a position that we have that assist the social workers as well. And our numbers just increased. And so we're doing the best we can, and our district recognized that need. And I'm just so excited that, society is now understanding that, social workers are very much needed in our world today.
Thank you. Ethan, would you like to add anything? Or should I go on?
Yes, I actually wanted to touch a little bit about undocumented students. Growing up in the community I've witnessed a lot of times, not just the school to prison pipeline, but also the school to deportation pipeline, which is a very common issue within the school I was in. And mainly it was my school district has a very I would like to say there's a very high socioeconomic issue, whereas our east side schools more are students of Filipino descent or of white descent who are more higher in the socioeconomic scale, whereas we have our west side schools, which is where I'm located at, and these are Latinx students. This is our border community, and we've seen law enforcement like as soon as like our freshman year come onto our campus, and they have pulled kids out of our classrooms, and it is not, there is a need to reform that, a serious need to reform this pipeline to ensure that not only just our documented, but also our undocumented students have the assets and tools needed to become or flourish within the community and have the endeavors that they wish to pursue. Yeah.
Thank you, Ethan. We're getting short on time. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to. Well, we already have a lot of questions coming in, so I will ask mine. What kinds of inclusive practices and policies need to exist to ensure that all students feel safe and included at school?
Yeah, I'll jump in at the beginning of that question. Again, I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks that our state created an Assembly Bill 168. The late Assemblyman Tyrone Thompson was a huge advocate for this bill getting passed. And we're just excited that we're able to at least be one of the districts and one of the states that actually put in legislature a bill that got passed to recognize the need for restorative practices. So again, I recommend that districts continue to advocate for this type of interventions because it's well needed. And being a social worker that actually work with students and understand that sometimes they're just struggling because they're hungry in class and they're frustrated. And we need to be able to get to those underlying issues of why they're behaving the way that they're behaving. And we need to increase our relationships with students and understand that, we care for them. And so I just wanted to be able to share that comment with you. And again, very proud of our state for being able to, kind of lead the charge in regards to restorative justice.
And I'd add, with regard to the pandemic, we know that there's been a disproportionate impact on students of color, undocumented students, students who are in foster care, homeless kids. There's been an increase in homelessness, but that's also oftentimes that's experienced as a trauma, as well as death of a family member from COVID. And because this is having a disparate impact on students of color across the nation, we are very ill-equipped to address the needs of students who experience trauma. Now, some of those students may qualify under Section 504 as having a disability, or maybe they have already have an ed plan and have been identified for special education, but there's a whole segment that really needs supports and services, whether or not they're eligible under, jump through the hoops of eligibility and identification. And we're very ill prepared, but one of the things we could do now is encourage through guidance that all this additional funding, the ARP money, this billions of dollars for education, we need guidance to ensure that it's equitably distributed, and also training folks to provide trauma-informed responses. And that's really important because that involves not only adding social workers and counselors and psychologists, but also training teachers. So we can use some of that money to improve the skill level and also restorative justice practices. Training the teachers to have those skills will have a long-lasting impact because we currently have done, unfortunately, a very poor job and not enough folks like Gerald Robinson and others in positions where they can train folks. But if we train and provide and train the trainers so that there are more of them, that could have a lasting impact from this next stimulus funding.
Thank you. If Amir and Ethan aren't going to add anything else, I did have a quick follow-up question for Gerald, and I'm going to combine it with an audience question. So the audience question is, we are currently trying to place a more involved restorative justice program in the Miami-Dade strategic plan. Is professional learning professional learning program something that other school districts can have access to? I think she's referring to what you had shared, as well as what would you say to a teacher who says that they don't have that training to do circles or restorative practices?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question, Mr. Pedroza and the audience member. I can go back and share how we got started. Myself as a social worker, I was basically the school social worker for a local high school here in town. And my principal came to me and said, hey, we need to be able to learn about restorative practices. Our suspensions and expulsions are going through the roof. And, I got a chance to meet with the students, and they want to be able to create some type of mechanism. So what we did is our principal did research how to go and obtain training in restorative practices. So he took myself and a couple of my colleagues. We flew to Colorado. This was about 7 years ago, and we learned about restorative practices. Now, at this particular conference, it happened to be some probation officers, very few teachers, and very few education people. But when we arrived there, we just soaked up all this information. And we got back as a team and basically created a program that met our needs on our campus. And so what I would say to different schools and different districts out there is that, you want to be able to create a program that is specific to your program. Now, here in our district, yes, we're going to give those professional development resources, the training, but we go into schools and we specifically train to meet that school's culture. And that's very important. And so what I also will say is that restorative practices is not going to happen overnight. Research says it takes anywhere from 3 or more years to be able to understand and be able to implement these effective strategies. So you got to take little baby steps. Start school-wide first and be able to educate your culture about restorative practices, and then get into the nuts and bolts of circles and conference programs and things of that nature. So the second part of the question, as I mentioned about circles, circles are not rocket science. It's amazing because it's a teachable and learnable type of intervention. Many of our teachers are effectively, starting with learning about circles from maybe a half-day training. So it's exciting to know that this is something that can be taught. You don't have to be a social worker to be able to learn how to do a circle. It's about listening. It's about sharing. We all have those interpersonal skills that we can latch on to. And so it's exciting to be able to participate in these circles like I've done in the past, and see that light bulb come on at the end of the circle and understand that your students now, they get it. And so it's exciting, but it is a process that can take place and can be taught. And again, it's all about building relationships. If we can just keep that one word in the back of our head and understand that we need to just strengthen our relationships with our students, I think we're going to be just fine. But we have to start there. So I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. And thank you, Victoria Ferrari, for asking that question. My next question comes from Tania Valencia, maybe for our researchers. The CRDC can be a very challenging resource to navigate. Does the CRDC currently collect and report data in a way where we can analyze the harsher discipline that may be experienced by Black Latino students?
Well, I can say that with our report, we also released 3 spreadsheets that have made it a lot easier. They're not perfect, but they do highlight disparities and the comparisons and the racial gaps. They make it easier to compare all the districts. You can filter if you just wanted to look at one state, or if you just wanted to highlight, let's say, what's happening to Latinx students, you can sort under Latinx students or Latinx students with disabilities. So we're creating tools, but they can be improved further. And so we welcome suggestions about how to do that. But with our report, if you go to our website, you will find 3 spreadsheets that you can download, and please give me feedback. I can also offer assistance to folks to walk them through that.
Thank you for offering that assistance. And we are going to also share resources in the chat at the end. So feel free to go to that website and read our many reports and resources that we've referenced today. This next question comes from Sydney Bencourt. How is the LGBTQ plus student population vulnerable to surveillance and over policing? If we could start with Ethan.
This is actually a really good question to ask. So the LGBTQ student population is vulnerable to surveillance and over-policing because sometimes teachers and support staff may not be adequately trained in order to handle situations regarding LGBTQ students. For example, most common are students within the transgender and non-binary communities often have an issue with pronouns, and therefore, as you can see, all the panelists have pronouns on their little name tags, and that's actually a really good way to normalize it. But sometimes teachers teachers and support staff can sometimes not memorize the pronouns of a particular student, which can cause very much upsetting of the student. But as well as, for example, bathrooms can be another issue that can result in the over-policing of LGBTQ students, particularly transgender students who may go in the bathroom that they of the gender they identify as, and that may be not necessarily to say that may not be conducive to the school policy, whereas some schools actually have a policy whereas they have to use the restroom with the sex they were assigned at birth, which can be very detrimental to the students' overall mental health, and therefore leaves them vulnerable to the over policing and over surveillance that was mentioned in the question.
I would just add one quick thing, is that we need to start collecting data on this whole population. And especially we could start at the high school, and it could be voluntary, but I think we have to normalize what has been, created, this sort of very bizarre sense that this is not normal. And part of that is collecting the data so that we can see what's happening to these kids.
Thank you so much. And I'm just so happy to be able to have a conversation where we recognize the intersectionalities of all of this issue on students from across the spectrum of LGBTQ, undocumented, Latinx, Black, students with disabilities, and it's a really engaging conversation to be listening to. My next question is from Maris Benavides. Aside from funding, what do you believe the biggest hurdles are to increasing the amount of social emotional learning or safety support in schools through social workers and guidance counselors?
I can start with.
Go ahead, Mr. Whitaker.
Sorry, I'll share really quickly. In Alabama, the state I was in before moving back to California, there were things within the state law, unfortunately, the structure that limited the amount of counselors that could be placed at a school. Kind of saying like it had to be a certain amount of students. So like the school size, you might have a rural school that's maybe 70 students. And the state law said you can't have a counselor at that school, but those schools and those students are entitled to one. So sometimes there's structural things within it, but I think there are a lot of cultural things too. As Mr. Robinson said, like the social work profession itself wasn't fully embraced, and it wasn't thought of being a school, including a school social worker. Yet we think of a police and other things in our school security guard. So we have to change the culture of what a school is and what our students are entitled to.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to piggyback off again, the social emotional learning. As a social worker, I've always had tools in my toolbox to be able to reach in and grab. And there's different types of curriculums that I utilize to be able to work with my students and teach them those social and emotional learning skills that they needed. And as I work with different counselors in our district, they are also trained to be able to provide social emotional tools to our students. And so this should be something where you can research a social emotional strategy and be able to implement that in with a student. Sometimes it's not as expensive. Obviously, yes, there's tons of curriculums out there that are can be quite pricey at times. But once again, there are other resources out there where you can go ahead and be able to take advantage of and utilize at a minimum cost or sometimes even free. And so, I challenge again my other social workers. If you're on the call today, and counselors, I know that is an issue that is huge right now. Social and emotional skills for our students are so important. And so, but I want to let you know that you can go online and be able to research and find some very good curriculums.
And I would just add, we need to bolster civil rights enforcement. So in our recently released study, we found that there are large districts across the country that identify no students who fall into this category of having not special education needs, but having disabilities where they need emotional, mental health supports, behavioral supports, accommodations in the classroom. And that disproportionately is affecting Latinx students and Native American students, as well as Black students. But 23% of all enrolled Latinx students are attending a school that either identifies not a single or very low numbers of students who are eligible under 504 only. So if we're not identifying the students, because once we identify them, they have a right to have these needs met. But if we fail to identify them, that's a civil rights violation. We are discriminating against them because we're failing to meet our obligations to identify that they have these needs. So we need much more civil rights enforcement to ensure that kids are being identified and that their needs are being met.
Agreed. And I think just in terms of the data, when I was writing my issue brief, it was very difficult to find some data. Some data is outdated. It's difficult to access. And so it needs to be available. It needs to be easy to understand. It needs to be enforced, definitely. I have another question, and I do want to mention that my heart goes out to the victims of the Colorado shooting recently. And so this brings me to the next question from Mayra Lozano. What evidence, if any, is there that SROs make schools safer or help prevent school shootings?
I want to start with that one. I think we can look at school shootings in recent history. And thank you for that question, Myra. But also, peace to the victims of all violence, gun violence. But if we think of the Parkland shooting that happened in Florida, right, 2 years ago, there was an SRO there hired and paid to make the school safer. And he, after the school shooting happened, basically he circled around and failed to respond. And the argument that he gave afterwards, I think, really should go to this argument and the question that Myra's asking. But the family of the victims, of the students who died, sued the school police and saying that they had a duty to protect their students, because like the question says, school police makes students safer. The parents were assuming that the police was there to protect them. But in court, what the police argued successfully in Florida was that they actually had no duty to protect the students. So they said their duty is only to protect people in their custody, right? Like if they arrest a student, then they have a duty to protect them, which goes against what we are taught or believe, right? That police are there to serve and protect. But many people know that maybe they're not there to serve and protect all people, right? So they literally legally argued that they have no duty to keep children safe. So if they're arguing that in court, and the research, as Dan was heading into it, there's no research that actually shows school police actually prevent school shootings or make them safer.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was it for but I think it's just because even in Florida, right, after that happened, they still passed the law that said a police has to be in every school. So even though, it goes against the truth, they're still legislating in the other way. In schools, they're still pushing for the other direction. So this is a very confusing question.
Yeah, there are empirical studies that show that adding money for school policing actually has no correlation with improved safety or improved school climate. And it does the opposite. And of course, a lot of kids of color see police, as we've been hearing, and it adds to their experience of trauma, especially if they've been victimized by police, by racist policing, and with all the growing awareness that this is a huge problem among the police. So it's a serious problem, and folks need to understand that the research does not support adding police to schools. It does not make kids safer. It doesn't make anyone feel safer, and the resources are misspent because we have a shortage of what kids really do need, which are folks like Gerald Robinson and not just social workers, but counselors, psychologists, nurses.
Yeah, and I also found that in my research that there's no evidence that suggests that SROs help prevent school shootings, and in fact, SROs contribute to a negative school climate and make students feel unsafe, and even undocumented students might associate an SRO with police or ICE, and what does that say about how we can care about all of our students feeling safe and included in schools? My next question comes from Paulette Purvis. What role can the present federal government play in implementing new policies regarding policing and social work in high schools throughout the country?
I think a quick answer to that is the Counseling and Not Criminalization Act, right? It literally tries to correct decades of the misspending, because there's so many police in our school because the federal government, including, people like President Obama after the Newtown shooting, right? I was a lawyer in Florida, and we had this elementary school district that got 20 new school police after the Newtown shooting for every elementary school, and some of them didn't have counselors. And that was President Obama's government, right? So the Counseling Not Criminalization Act, we literally have to undo that, and we have to incentivize schools hiring social workers, counselors, and provide money, and kind of draw the line in the sand with school police and acknowledge that they don't have to be in our schools. And just go back 2 generations, in the 1970s, there were just 200 school police. And now there's literally, over 100 times as many as that. I mean, we have over 200 school police here in Los Angeles. So the federal government has to play the role because they're responsible for the growth of school police.
And they can, incentivize through the ARP funds that schools spend down or eliminate their school police. There should be incentives to do that, to replace. We're not talking about doing nothing, because there are times where you need a youth counselor or someone who has an expert in helping de-escalate conflicts. We're not saying that kids never do anything dangerous or make folks feel unsafe. But the response to that is not policing. The response has to be folks who know how to de-escalate those situations in ways that keep kids in school and make the whole community feel safer.
And I can add that, again, our district has recognized that need. And like I said earlier, I couldn't be so proud to be a licensed social worker in our district, because to see us grow like we've done over the past few years, and to be able to add a position like I mentioned earlier, our safe school professionals, to work along the side of our licensed social workers. And in some schools, we even have both in one school. And we're not perfect, don't get me wrong, but we recognize the mental health need in our district. And I'm glad that our administration has recognized that, and we're doing something about it. And just proud to be able to say that, I'm a licensed social worker, and I see, my colleagues around the state of Nevada and here in Clark County, we're doing all we can to service our students. And I couldn't be more proud to be able to just be a part of that growth.
And one more thing the federal government can do is to recruit more people of color, people who have come from the communities where they've experienced trauma and racism, to be the school counselors, to be the school psychologists, to be the superintendents and teachers and principals. We really have to do more to not just recruit them, but to retain them, and to make this a really a viable path, because a lot of research shows that dramatically increases the sense of community and the safety in these schools.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and that is going to be from Karima Mariama Arthur Q. Arthur, just the Q was for question. How can we both educate and empower students around safety and behavioral expectations within the current academic environment?
I'll start with that briefly, and that's a really important question, Karima, because some students are misbehaving and we have to model ways to do that, right? I think the fact that we no longer have, bullying in the news as much coming from the White House, I think really helps, but it's really up to adults to model the behavior, right? Because students learn from watching each other, right? So accountability, true accountability, and a system that really respects young people. We can't just criminalize young people for things like, for example, here in California, teachers, if a teacher misses 10 days, they're penalized less than a student who misses 10 days. And we can't have separate systems like that, So lots of things like that.
And I can add too, because I've seen throughout our district that we have students that are getting involved. They have different programs where they're advocating for their students. And so I'm excited to be able to say that, I've seen where students will say, oh, you know what, that's a really good program. I need to get involved in that program. And so, they'll obviously understand, what the goal is in that particular program. It's great to see that. I know at the former high school that I worked at, we had peer advocates that actually advocated for students. And, maybe a student is struggling, once they became a peer advocate and they kind of understand, how they could assist that student that was struggling. And because sometimes, the message comes or is understood a lot better when it comes from a peer. And that's where our peers are so important. And if they can get involved in things that are happening on different campuses across the country, that could really make a difference.
I definitely wanted to add on to what Mr. Robinson said. Empowering other students to follow the leads of their students to make a positive and lasting change within their community is absolutely vital to ensure that we have this cultivating sense of communities. Like, for example, I'm a student who has received mental health certifications. I'm certified through Mental Health America San Diego. I have a restorative practices certification through our San Diego Teen Court. These certifications allow for me to teach other students to make a positive change within the communities. And my school is one of the few schools in my school district that has a peer advocates program, a peer mediation program, a peer counseling program. And it is absolutely vital that these programs are accepted, not only just within other schools within the state of California where I reside, but also nationwide, to ensure that we can help reform justice within our school systems, because essentially it starts with peer-to-peer learning. The most influence that we receive as students is from who sits next to us in class, our fellow students. So it's absolutely vital to ensure that we make sure that we empower students to teach others to make a lasting and vital change within our communities.
Yeah, and it's great. I want to say you're inspiring. I apologize for my comment earlier. I mentioned that you were impressive for a high school student. You're impressive, period. And thank you for your peer advocacy. Well, we're at time. So thank you so much to all of our panelists and audience members for being here today and engaging in this important conversation. In conclusion, I want to highlight that policy advocates, elected officials, and youth have put forth a number of solutions that center the safety, mental health, and inclusivity of all students. Legislation and policy must address the disproportionate impact of SROs and exclusionary discipline practices on students of color and students with disabilities, the lack of reliable discipline data, the need for increased school-based mental health providers, and the inclusion of restorative practices. Reimagining student safety must always include student and youth voices and must equip all school leaders and staff with the tools to listen to and proactively support and empower students rather than punish, exclude, and arrest them. I invite you to continue to read more about this topic. Some resources should be going on in the chat. I leave you with the words of Nava, a Latina student organizer involved with the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, who has shared with me how she reimagines student safety. This is about us. This is about investing in our people, in our community, in our young folks, and showing them what real safety can be. That comes from communication and relationships and being able to resolve conflict without anyone else getting hurt. It's about acknowledging the root causes. It's about having resources. We've had a conversation about this campaign with so many people for such a long time that everything that needs to be said and get out there has been said and is out there. I want to reaffirm that all of this work that we do, like all of this campaigning and organizing, and like that summer spent outside every day, we do this out of love. Everything we do is for love, for our people, for our friends, for people that we don't even know. When we do this, it's coming out of a place of joy and resistance and love. And we're going to get through this, and we're going to celebrate every little win that we get, no matter how big or how small. This is our fight. These are our lives, and we're going to live them with joy and no regret. Those were words from Nava, a Latina student organizer. And this concludes our panel for today. Thank you for your attendance and attention. I invite you to always listen to students, for they imagine a safer, more inclusive school environment, and they are our hope for a more equitable future.